I'm going to be direct with you about something that's been troubling me lately. I've been watching investors in their 50s and 60s make a decision that frankly keeps me up at night. They're doing something with their retirement portfolios that feels prudent, sounds conservative, and looks safe, but it's actually one of the riskiest moves they could make at this stage of their lives. What I'm talking about isn't some exotic investment scheme or a speculative gamble. It's the opposite. These investors are making a choice that seems so reasonable, so sensible, that almost no one questions it. But after managing money through 7 major market cycles and watching how different strategies play out over decades, I can tell you, this decision has destroyed more retirement security than any market crash I've witnessed. Let me explain what I mean by walking you through what I've learned about retirement investing, why conventional wisdom gets it wrong, and what you should actually be thinking about if you're over 50 and planning for the next chapter of your life. The decision I'm warning you about is this: moving entirely to cash or ultra-conservative investments because you're protecting your nest egg. It sounds smart, it feels safe. And in 2026, with all the uncertainty we're facing, I understand the temptation more than ever. But here's what I've observed over 5 decades. The investors who think they're protecting themselves by eliminating all risk often end up guaranteeing the very outcome they fear most: running out of money in retirement. Now, before you think I'm advocating recklessness, let me be clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not suggesting that a 60-year-old should invest like a 30-year-old. I'm not recommending you put your retirement savings into cryptocurrencies or meme stocks. And I'm certainly not telling you to ignore risk. What I am saying is that there's a fundamental misunderstanding about what risk actually means when you're planning for retirement. Most investors think risk is the possibility of losing money in the short term, but the real risk, the one that actually destroys retirement plans, is the certainty of losing purchasing power over time. Think about this for a moment. If you're 55 years old today, you might live another 30 or 35 years. That's not a short-term investment horizon. That's longer than most people's entire working careers. And over that time horizon, inflation isn't a possibility. It's a guarantee. I've been tracking this data since I started in this business in 1969. Over any 30-year period, the purchasing power of a dollar has been cut roughly in half by inflation, sometimes more, sometimes less. But the direction is always the same. Your money buys less tomorrow than it does today. Now here's where the math gets uncomfortable for people who think they're being conservative. If you move all your retirement money into cash or money market funds yielding, say, 3 or 4%, and inflation runs at 3%, you're barely keeping up. And that's before taxes. After taxes, you're actually losing ground every single year. Let me show you what this means in practice. Suppose you retire at 60 with $1 million. You think to yourself, I'll just keep this safe in cash and live off the interest. At 4%, that's $40,000 a year. Sounds reasonable, right? But fast forward 15 years, you're 75 now. If inflation has averaged just 3% over those 15 years, that $40,000 in annual income now has the purchasing power of about $26,000. You haven't touched your principal, you've been conservative, and yet your standard of living has been cut by more than a third. This is what I call the tyranny of safety. You've protected yourself against the risk you could see, market volatility, while exposing yourself completely to the risk you couldn't see as clearly, the slow, steady erosion of your purchasing power. I learned this lesson watching what happened to retirees after the inflation of the 1970s. The ones who thought they were being prudent by staying in bonds and cash got absolutely crushed. Not by a market crash, those you can recover from, but by something far more insidious: the gradual realization that their safe investments weren't safe at all. One of my clients from that era, a retired engineer, had done everything right according to the conventional wisdom of his time. He'd saved diligently, paid off his mortgage, and moved his entire portfolio into treasury bonds and certificates of deposit. He thought he was set. 10 years into retirement, he came to see me. His income hadn't changed. He was still getting the same interest payments, but his expenses had nearly doubled. His property taxes had gone up. His insurance premiums had increased. His medical costs had climbed. The groceries that used to cost him $50 now cost $90. Howard, he said to me, I did everything they told me to do. I was conservative. I didn't take risks. So why am I running out of money? That conversation changed how I think about retirement investing. The problem wasn't that he'd taken too much risk. The problem was that he'd focused on the wrong risk. Now, I want to be very careful here because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, but Howard, what if the market crashes right when I retire? What if I lose 30 or 40% of my savings just when I need to start drawing on it? That's a legitimate concern. It's called sequence of returns risk, and it's real. If you retire in 2008 and the market immediately drops 40%, that's a problem. You're selling shares at depressed prices to fund your living expenses, and you might never recover. But here's what I've learned from studying this issue. The solution to sequence of returns risk isn't to eliminate all market exposure. The solution is to structure your portfolio so you're not forced to sell stocks at the worst possible time. This is where most investors and their advisors get it wrong. They think in terms of a single portfolio with a single asset allocation. You're either aggressive or conservative. You're either in stocks or out of stocks. But that's not how I think about retirement portfolios. I think about them in layers, each serving a different purpose and operating on a different time horizon. The first layer is what I call your stability layer. This is money you'll need in the next 2 to 3 years. This money absolutely should be in cash or short-term bonds. You don't want any volatility here because you know you're going to need this money soon. If you need $30,000 a year and you want 3 years of coverage, that's $90,000 in stable, liquid investments. The second layer is your medium-term layer. This is money you'll need in years 3 through 10. This can be in a mix of bonds, dividend-paying stocks, and other income-generating investments. There's some volatility here, but you have time to ride it out. The third layer is your growth layer. This is money you won't need for 10 years or more. And here's the key insight that most people miss. If you're 60 years old and you won't need this money for 10 years, you have a 10-year time horizon. That's plenty of time to invest in quality stocks and ride out market volatility. This layered approach solves the sequence of returns problem. Even if the market crashes the day you retire, you're not forced to sell stocks. You live off your stability layer while your growth layer recovers. By the time you need to tap your stock holdings, the market has likely recovered. I've seen this approach work through multiple market cycles. Clients who structured their portfolios this way sailed through 2008, through 2020, through 2022. They didn't panic because they knew they had years of expenses covered in stable investments. They could wait for the market to recover. But there's another reason this approach matters, and it gets back to what I said earlier about inflation. Your growth layer isn't just about surviving market crashes. It's about maintaining your purchasing power over a 30-year retirement. Think about the math. Over the past century, stocks have returned about 10% annually on average. After inflation, that's about 7% real return. Bonds have returned about 5% nominally, or about 2% after inflation. Cash has barely kept pace with inflation over long periods. If you need your money to last 30 years and maintain its purchasing power, you need growth. There's simply no way around it. You can't earn your way to a secure retirement with 3% returns when inflation is running at 3%. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, but Howard, those are historical returns. What if the next 30 years are different? What if stocks don't return 10%? You're right to ask that question. I've always believed that we can't predict the future by simply extrapolating the past. Markets change, valuations matter, starting points matter. But here's what I've observed. Even in periods when stock returns were below average, they still outpaced bonds and cash over long time horizons. Even if stocks only return 7% instead of 10% over the next 30 years, that's still substantially better than the 3 or 4% you'll get from cash. And here's the thing about retirement planning. You don't need spectacular returns. You just need returns that exceed inflation by a reasonable margin. If inflation averages 3% and you can earn 6%, that 3% real return compounds powerfully over 30 years. Let me show you what I mean with some actual numbers. Suppose you retire at 60 with $1 million. You need $40,000 a year to live on, adjusted for inflation. You expect to live to 90. Scenario 1, you invest everything in cash earning 4%. You draw $40,000 the first year, increasing with inflation. By age 75, you're out of money. You still have 15 years to live, but your savings are gone. Scenario 2. You use the layered approach I described. You keep 3 years of expenses in cash, another 7 years in bonds, and the rest in a diversified stock portfolio. The stocks average 7% returns over 30 years. You make it to age 90 with money left over. The difference isn't a market crash. The difference is the slow, steady erosion of purchasing power in scenario 1 versus the growth that outpaces inflation in scenario 2. This is what I mean when I say that avoiding all market risk is actually the riskiest thing you can do. You're not avoiding risk. You're just choosing a different risk. You're choosing the certainty of declining purchasing power over the possibility of market volatility. Now, let me address another concern I hear frequently from investors over 50. What if I need the money before the market recovers? This is where the stability layer becomes crucial. If you maintain 2 to 3 years of expenses in cash, you have a buffer. You're not forced to sell stocks in a down market. You can wait. I learned this lesson myself during the 2008 financial crisis. Oaktree had clients who needed distributions, but because we'd structured things properly, because we maintained adequate liquidity, we weren't forced to sell distressed assets at the worst possible prices. We could wait for recovery. The clients who got hurt in 2008 weren't the ones who had money in stocks. They were the ones who didn't have adequate liquidity and were forced to sell at the bottom. They turned paper losses into permanent losses because they hadn't planned properly. This brings me to another critical point about retirement investing that most people misunderstand. The goal isn't to avoid all losses. The goal is to avoid permanent losses. Markets go down. That's not a bug in the system, it's a feature. Volatility is the price you pay for long-term returns. If you can't tolerate any volatility, you're going to end up in cash. And we've already discussed why that's problematic. But here's what I've learned about managing volatility in retirement. It's much more tolerable when you know you don't have to sell. If you have 3 years of expenses in cash, a market decline doesn't force your hand. You can be patient. You can wait for recovery. This is fundamentally different from how most people think about retirement investing. They think the goal is to eliminate volatility. I think the goal is to structure your portfolio so that volatility doesn't matter. There's one more aspect of this that I want to address, and it's perhaps the most important: the psychological dimension of retirement investing. I've noticed something over the years. When people retire, they often make an emotional shift in how they think about money. During their working years, they were comfortable with risk because they had time to recover and they were adding to their savings regularly. But the day they retire, suddenly everything feels different. This emotional shift is understandable. You're no longer earning a paycheck. You're drawing down savings instead of building them up. It feels scary. The natural instinct is to become more conservative to protect what you have. But this emotional instinct, while understandable, often leads to poor decisions. You become so focused on protecting your principal that you forget about the real goal: maintaining your purchasing power and standard of living over a 30-year retirement. I've seen this play out dozens of times. Someone retires with what seems like plenty of money. They move everything to cash or bonds. 10 years later, they're stressed about money because their expenses have grown, but their income hasn't. The irony is that they thought they were being prudent. They thought they were protecting themselves, but they were actually guaranteeing the outcome they feared most. This is why I started this conversation by saying that the decision to move entirely to cash or ultra-conservative investments is one of the most dangerous things you can do in retirement. It feels safe, but it's not. It's the illusion of safety. Real safety in retirement comes from having a portfolio that can maintain its purchasing power over decades. Real safety comes from having adequate liquidity so you're never forced to sell at the wrong time. Real safety comes from understanding the risks you face and structuring your investments accordingly. So what should you do if you're over 50 and planning for retirement? Let me give you a framework based on what I've learned over 5 decades. First, forget about your age. Your investment time horizon isn't determined by how old you are. It's determined by when you'll need the money. If you're 60 but won't need certain assets for 20 years, you have a 20-year time horizon for those assets. Second, structure your portfolio in layers. Keep 2 to 3 years of expenses in cash or short-term bonds. Keep another 5 to 7 years in intermediate-term bonds and dividend-paying stocks. Invest the rest for growth in a diversified portfolio of quality stocks. Third, understand that volatility isn't the same as risk. Volatility is temporary price fluctuations. Risk is the permanent loss of purchasing power. Don't confuse the two. Fourth, plan for inflation. Assume your expenses will double over the next 25 years. Make sure your portfolio can keep pace. Fifth, maintain discipline. When markets drop, and they will, don't panic and sell. That's when you rely on your stability layer and wait for recovery. I want to be clear about something. I'm not suggesting this is easy. Watching your portfolio decline is never pleasant, even when you know it's temporary. But the alternative, slowly watching your purchasing power erode over decades, is far worse. I've lived through enough market cycles to know that volatility is temporary, but inflation is permanent. I've seen enough retirement plans to know that running out of money is a bigger risk than market fluctuations, and I've managed enough portfolios to know that the investors who do best aren't the ones who avoid all risk. They're the ones who understand which risks matter. If you're over 50 and you've moved everything to cash because it feels safe, I urge you to reconsider. You're not eliminating risk, you're just choosing a different risk, and it's probably the wrong one. The goal of retirement investing isn't to avoid all losses. It's to maintain your purchasing power and standard of living over what might be a very long retirement. That requires growth. It requires accepting some volatility. And it requires thinking beyond the conventional wisdom that says safety means eliminating all market exposure. After 50 years in this business, I've learned that the most dangerous words in investing are, "This time it's different." But I've also learned that the second most dangerous words are, "I'm being conservative." Because often what looks conservative in the short term is actually quite risky in the long term. Don't let the illusion of safety destroy your retirement security. Structure your portfolio properly, maintain adequate liquidity, and give yourself the growth you need to maintain your purchasing power over what I hope will be a long and comfortable retirement. That's what I've learned, that's what the data shows, and that's what I believe will serve you best in the years ahead.